Welcome to Weird PVD, the podcast. Every week, your host, Sherry Kasperzak, takes you to the odd corners of beautiful Providence, Rhode Island. From big blue bugs to unique art, from weird history to weird food, you'll never look at Rhode Island's creative capital the same again. Tune in every Weird Wednesday. What is up, weirdos? Gender identity is a topic we hear a lot about these days, but it was rare for people to discuss their identity as a man, a woman, neither, both, or something outside of societal gender expectations even a couple of decades ago. That doesn't mean that transgender or non-binary people didn't exist. They've always existed. In fact, this week on Weird PVD, the podcast, I'm going to introduce you to a non-binary person from the 1700s. We're traveling back to the late 18th century in New England to a time of revolution, religious awakening, and radical new ideas about identity. This is the story of a person who rejected not only their birth name, but also their gender, and declared themselves reborn as something entirely different. They called themselves Public Universal Friend, and their story is truly fascinating. Now, for today's episode, I want to make it clear that I will refer to the Public Universal Friend's birth name only as a historical reference, and after that, I will only refer to them with they, them pronouns and as Public Universal Friend or the Friend. And just a quick trigger warning for people who don't understand how pronouns work. This episode might not be for you. Take the time that you'd listen to this podcast and go read a book. To understand the Public Universal Friend, we need to start with the religious world they emerged from, the Society of Friends, otherwise known as the Quakers. Now, Quakerism began in England in the mid 1600s, amid a time of religious upheaval. In fact, the founder, George Fox, challenged the rigid hierarchies of the Church of England. He believed that every person could experience God directly, without priests, without rituals, without any elaborate ceremonies. This belief became known as the inner light, the idea that there is something divine within every individual. Quakers rejected social hierarchy. They refused to bow to nobility. They avoided titles like sir or madam. Many refused to participate in war, making them some of the earliest advocates of pacifism. They also practiced radical equality, for the time anyway, and they allowed women to speak during meetings and take on leadership roles. Imagine that. Meetings were often held in silence, with participants speaking only when they felt spiritually moved. By the 18th century, Quakers had spread to the American colonies, including Rhode Island, a place already known for its religious tolerance. And if you haven't seen my podcast on Roger Williams and how he was eaten by an apple tree, go check it out. Roger had some really radical ideas about religion for his time, and he was a Puritan minister, so that says a lot. Back to today's story, though. Our story begins in Cumberland, Rhode Island, home of my good friend and amazing filmmaker, Mark Azofsky. Shout out to Mark. Back in 1752, a child was born into a Quaker family and given a name at birth, Jemima Wilkinson. Growing up, they lived a fairly typical life for the time, farming, participating in the local community, and attending Quaker meetings. But something changed dramatically in 1776, the same year the United States declared independence against England. At the age of 23, this individual fell gravely ill. Their condition worsened to the point that family and neighbors believed death was imminent. And then something extraordinary happened. According to their own account and that of their followers, the person died, not in a metaphorical way, but in a literal way, died, and then returned. And when they revived, they claimed that they were no longer the same person. The soul that had inhabited the body before was gone. Now, in its place was a divine spirit, one that had been sent by God with a mission. From that time on, they refused their birth name. They also refused gendered pronouns, and instead, they adopted a new identity, the public universal friend. In the 18th century, rejecting your name was already unusual. Rejecting your gender was completely unimaginable. The public universal friend insisted on being addressed only by that title, never by their former name. They wore clothing that blended traditionally masculine and feminine elements, creating a deliberately ambiguous appearance. They avoided gendered language entirely, and this wasn't framed like our modern sense of identity or expression, but instead it was rooted in a deeply spiritual claim that they were no longer a human individual in the traditional sense anyway, but they were a vessel for divine truth. To their followers, it wasn't strange, it was sacred. Now, the Friend began preaching soon after their recovery. Their message drew heavily from Quaker beliefs with a more urgent revivalist tone to them. This was the era of the First Great Awakening, when emotional, charismatic preaching was spreading across the colonies. The Friend spoke about repentance and moral living and the importance of preparing one's soul. They traveled throughout Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, gathering a devoted following by preaching about the importance of giving to the poor and opposing slavery and staying celibate, even though that last part wasn't particularly popular and most of the followers did get married. About 50 women did stay single, though, and called themselves the Faithful Sisterhood, which honestly sounds super badass. Some listeners were deeply moved. Others were skeptical and even outright hostile. Critics accused the Friend of deception or fanaticism, but followers believed they were witnessing something extraordinary, a person chosen by God beyond the constraints of ordinary identity. But then one night, the Friend found themselves accused of attempted murder. Two women who attended a sermon given by the Friend's disciples had an argument. And later that night, one woman named Abigail entered the other's room with the goal of strangling her to death. But instead of wrapping her hands around Sarah's neck, she saw that another woman, Anna, was in the room, so she left without incident. Now, apparently, Sarah witnessed this because she claimed there was an attempted murder. Anna refuted this claim, saying that she would have remembered if someone tried to kill her, but Sarah wasn't satisfied to let the story go. She told a Philadelphia paper that the Public Universal Friend had tried to kill her. It just so happened that the Friend was in Rhode Island at the time and couldn't have possibly done it. So there goes that. Eventually, the Friend and their followers established a communal settlement called the Gore in Western New York. The community aimed to live according to shared spiritual principles of simplicity, devotion, and moral discipline. But life there wasn't always peaceful. There were some disputes over property, leadership, and authority. Some followers eventually broke away, but others remained fiercely loyal, and this actually came in very handy for the Friend. In one incident, the Friend had to, well, outrun the law because they were accused of blasphemy, of all things. Two men, William Potter and James Parker, claimed that the Friend had held a sermon in which they tried to resurrect William's recently deceased daughter. Now, someone who was suspicious of this alleged resurrection plan had tried to stab the corpse, only for the daughter to jump up and run from the room. The two men were able to obtain a warrant for the Friend's arrest. An officer approached the horse riding public friend who fled with the cop in hot pursuit. And I'm laughing because the visual that I have is really funny and kind of badass. So I don't know if you get that image yourself listening to the story, but that's what I've got in my head, and it made me chuckle a little bit. So the friend was able to escape to a supporter's home, and this person outright barred the cops from coming in. Then a second arrest attempt happened. This time, the officer brought a deputy with him. The two of them came to the friend's home, but also in the home were my previously mentioned badass faithful sisterhood, who responded by throwing themselves at the officers. And before long, the two men were thrown out of the house, their clothing torn from the scuffle. We do love some women who will throw down to defend what's right. Finally, the police got to the friend's followers, and about 30 members of the police force tried breaking down the door of a commune home with an axe. And at this point, the friend just gave himself up and came along. Now, the judge in the case against the friend for blasphemy was Morgan Lewis, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and would later go on to be the governor of New York. And he threw the case out. His response was pretty epic. Quote, "What is this crap? Blasphemy isn't a crime. And if there were a law making it one, that would be unconstitutional." End quote. The friend themselves became a central figure of both inspiration and controversy. They didn't claim to be Christ, but the language, being sent by God, bringing a message of salvation, it led some people to draw conclusions. In fact, when asked outright if they were a man or a woman, the friend answered, "I am what I am," which some saw as a godlike answer. And in a post revolutionary America that valued religious freedom and individual skepticism, reactions to the friend were mixed. What makes the public universal friend especially fascinating today is how they challenge our assumptions about identity in early American history. We often think of non binary or gender non conforming identities as modern concepts. But here was a person in the 1700s who explicitly rejected gender categories altogether, not in a quiet or private way, but publicly and persistently and as a central part of their identity. They didn't just live differently, they insisted the world recognize them differently. And remarkably, many people did. Their followers respected their chosen name and avoided gender language, even in written records. Now, if they could do it in the 1700s, what are we even doing, people? It's not that hard to be a decent person. Think about it. Get with it. The public universal friend continued leading their community and preaching into the early 19th century. They died in 1819, or depending on how you interpret their story, perhaps they had already died decades earlier. Now, after their passing, the movement gradually declined. Without this central figure to guide them, the community got a bit fragmented. But the story didn't disappear. Historians and scholars and readers continue to rediscover the friend, just as I did. I'd never heard the story of the public universal friend before I started doing some research. And I think they're not just a religious figure, but a person who pushed the boundaries of identity and language and belief. So, how should we understand the public universal friend? Were they a religious visionary, a charismatic leader, a radical thinker ahead of their time? Or were they something else entirely? What's clear is that they lived in a way that defied the expectations of their era. In a world that demanded clear categories, male or female, they chose something different. They chose to become a friend. Thank you so much for joining me today on Weird PVD, the podcast. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe on YouTube or give me a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find me on Instagram. I'm over there at weird_PVD. It is a vibrant, amazing community of people who share all of the weird, wonderful things in Providence, Rhode Island. And if you like weird history, medical oddities, and the like, you are going to love my TikTok channel. You can find me on TikTok at weird.pvd. And don't forget to keep PVD weird.